They came with lanterns and lists, ordinary hands pressed into overnight duty. A farmer, a shopkeeper, a father. Any man might be summoned to walk the lane, call the hour, or ease a quarrel before it burned. Lantern light trembled across low roofs, lifted the smoke from hearths, touched the faces of children pressed to window panes. Those small flames kept towns breathing, kept fires and thieves at bay, and made public life feel contained enough to sleep. But the same light carried different meanings for different people. Down one path, a watchman's slow steps meant reassurance. A toll of the bell, a courteous question, a neighbor sent back to bed. Down another road, the lanterns marked the slow advance of mounted men whose orders were clear. Stop, identify, restrain. They checked passes, questioned movement, returned runaways, enforced curfews. Where one household drew comfort from a steady lantern, another household drew breath and hid in silence. Hear the sounds. The rasp of leather reins, the clank of a hoof on a plank bridge, a dog's bark cut short. Smell the chill of river fog and tobacco smoke. Feel the rough wood of the post where a sheriff's notice is hammered into the meeting house board. These are small things, ordinary details, but they stitch together two different experiences of the same public space. Protection for some, surveillance for others. Tonight we follow that thin thread from neighborly obligation to organized force. We trace how duties carried out by ordinary hands became formal offices, how practices born in local need were adapted and repurposed, and how choices made in courtrooms and plantation fields shaped who would feel safe and who would live in fear. Listen closely to one night, one lane, one lantern, and you will hear the moment when protection and power braided together, a knot whose effects reach forward across centuries. Before we go deeper, let's be clear about who we're talking about. For different forms of authority that shaped early American life. The constable, the night watch, the sheriff, and the slave patrol. I'll name what each did, where and when it mattered most, and what you should watch for as we trace their lives forward. The night watch. Town set men to walk after dark long, before uniformed forces existed. Boston's watch, formally created in 1631, is one of the earliest recorded examples. Men posted to guard against fire, theft, and disorder after sunset. These watchmen carried lanterns, called the hours, and issued fines or punishments when local ordinances required it. Their ordinance-based authority and nightly presence established the basic idea of patrolling public space. The constable. This office came from English local law and arrived with settlers. Constables appeared in Plymouth and other New England records in the 1630s as local enforcers who served court papers, collected fines, licensed taverns, and kept the peace. They were typically ordinary townsmen given specific duties, not full-time professionals, which meant enforcement was deeply embedded in everyday social ties and obligations. The sheriff carried broader authority across counties. Drawing on the English shire reeve tradition, colonial sheriffs enforced court orders, managed jails, collected taxes, and sometimes raised posses. Their role linked scattered settlements to formal legal systems. Where a constable handled a neighborly dispute, a sheriff could mobilize the apparatus of the courts. This made sheriffs crucial as settlements expanded. The slave patrol. Distinct from those civic roles, slave patrols emerged where plantation economies and large enslaved populations created particular pressures. South Carolina formalized patrol systems in the early 1700s with laws and practices often dated to 1704, and similar patrols spread through other southern colonies in the 18th century. Their purpose was explicit: to chase and return runaways, enforce curfews, and deter resistance. These patrols were organized to protect a social and economic order dependent on slavery, not to protect everyone who lived nearby. These four institutions did overlapping work, keeping order, enforcing property rules, and controlling movement, but they were not morally equivalent. The watch and constable grew from civic obligation and immediate municipal needs. The sheriff extended legal reach across counties. The slave patrol enforced an economy built on human bondage. Their methods sometimes resemble one another. Patrols on roads, stops of people, use of force, practices that could be deployed in different moral directions depending on who held power. What I promise next. In the coming sections, I'll do 3 things you'll notice most viewers remember. First, I'll follow one ordinary night and a couple real records so you can hear the human texture of enforcement. Second, I'll show how specific laws and decisions, think Boston, 1631, South Carolina, 1704, created durable practices of stopping, questioning, and controlling movement. Third, I'll lay out why scholars still argue about origins. Some see slave patrols as a decisive root of American policing. Others emphasize English watch and constable traditions and economic demands of commerce. We'll weigh those claims using documents and statutes, not slogans. If any of this surprises you, tap like. It helps this channel know to dig deeper. Next, I'll follow one night down a single lane and read the records that show how these forces cross paths. Approve and I'll continue with that micro story, plus the first primary source detail you won't see in most textbooks. Think of one night, reconstructed from town minutes and patrol ordinances, and listen closely to what ordinary life sounded like when law was a set of local duties. Start in a New England lane. A watchman shoulders his lantern and steps into fog that rolls down from a river. He's a common man pressed into service, unpaid, expected, walking the same path his neighbors travel by day. His job is simple in words. Call the hours, look for fires, stop fights, warn strangers. In Boston, that practice was formalized as early as 1631, when the town set a watch to guard against fire and theft. The watchman's tools are small and loud, a wooden rattle, a bell, a list of names and fines. He passes a meeting house where notices are nailed. He peeks in taverns to count the lamps still lit. And he crosses a plank span where a dog barks and then falls quiet. To most families, a lantern means sleep resumed. Now cross the map and hold the same hour in a southern plantation district. The sky is the same color, but the stakes are different. Men ride in groups charged by law to stop and question black people moving near roads or between fields. Early 18th century statutes in South Carolina and neighboring colonies set these patrols in motion. Their stated aims were to chase runaways, enforce curfews, and deter collective resistance. A patrol is not a single watchman with a bell. It is a summoned posse, an organized obligation of able-bodied men whose authority is backed by statute and by the planter economy that paid for its continuation. The sound here is different. The beat of hooves, the creak of saddles, the low order bark to dismount and present a pass. Imagine an unrecorded, typical scene pieced together from court minutes and patrol laws. A black woman ferries a small parcel across the road toward her master's house. A patrol approaches from the hill. A single shout, an order to halt. She must produce permission and escort, or else risk a search and being taken away to a nearby plantation jail. For enslaved families, daily movement required paperwork or constant company. Absence of either could mean punishment or sale. For a poor white patroller, the duty offers authority and a small stipend. For a planter, it secures labor and the plantation's profit. The law and the economy mesh here, and the result is a regulated public space in which not all bodies are treated the same. Back in town, the constable's ledger records fines and tavern licenses, domestic quarrels, and stolen goods. The same administrative language that lists a seized horse or the cost of a broken window also records commands to patrol or muster men for a chase. Municipal records from New England towns show constables performing a wide range of duties from the 1630s onward, a reminder that enforcement was often domestic, embedded, and personal. Yet the patrol ordinances of the southern colonies show another logic, one that codified suspicion by law and delegated force to those who would uphold the economic order. What makes the night stick in memory is not a single headline moment, but the accumulated, daily intimacies of authority. The watchman who decides whether to wake a family or let an argument cool. The patrol that checks a traveler's pass and, in doing so, decides who may cross a road. The sheriff who posts an order that changes a neighbor into a legal subject. Those small administrative choices produce different lived realities along the same lane of night. If you could read every town's minutes and every plantation statute side by side, you see the same language of control applied toward different ends, and you hear how ordinary tools, lanterns, lists, and riders, came to carry extraordinary power. If this scene surprised you, tap like. It tells us to keep unpacking these real moments from the records. Comment more if you like a deeper reconstruction from a single surviving court case next episode. In the colonies, two early forms of local enforcement set the pattern for public authority. the night watch that paced the streets after dark, and the constable who carried the law into everyday life. Both roles came from English practice, but in America they adapted quickly to new geography, thin populations, and urgent threats: fires, theft, and the fragile logistics of supply and trade. The night watch was straightforward in purpose and visible in practice. In Boston, town leaders established a formal watch in 1631. An officer and a handful of men posted to patrol the neck after sunset, call the hours, and warn of danger. Watchmen walked routes with lanterns and rattles, enforced curfews, fined rule breakers, and acted as the first line of urban order. Their presence stamped public space with a regular legal attention. A town that kept a watch told residents, plainly, that someone was looking after streets and property after dark. The tools and rituals of the watch mattered. A wooden rattle or bell signaled authority across narrow lanes. Lantern light marked the man on duty. Lists and town ordinances defined what could be punished. These were practical instruments, not symbols. When a fire broke out in a timber town or a shipment went missing from a wharf, a watchman's early warning could prevent catastrophe. At the same time, the watch's enforcement was limited. Unpaid or poorly paid men, often with other jobs, did what they could. Their duty was patchwork by design, a communal safety net rather than a full-time force. The constable operated differently, but with similar roots. The office arrived with settlers as an import from English parish practice. Plymouth appointed its first constable in 1632, and other colonial towns followed. Constables served court papers, collected fines, licensed taverns, served summonses, and carried out small-scale arrests. In small communities, the constable was a familiar figure, a neighbor who enforced the town's orders and, in doing so, blurred the line between private acquaintance and public official. That proximity shaped how laws were enforced. Social ties mattered in who was punished and how strictly. Because these roles were local and often unpaid, enforcement looked like communal responsibility. Neighbors policing neighbors, magistrates leaning on public censure, and civic meetings allocating duty. That model worked when populations were small and behaviors visible, but it also carried trade-offs. Local enforcement could be inconsistent, prone to favoritism, and vulnerable to local power dynamics. A constable might hesitate to cite a prominent neighbor or might take extraordinary measures against a poor family. The paperwork of a constable's ledger, fines, licenses, seized goods, reads like a map of everyday conflicts and who held leverage in town politics. Both the watch and the constable taught important lessons in authority. That public order could be maintained through routine presence, that law could be woven into daily life, and that enforcement need not be professional to be effective. Yet those same lessons limited how far these institutions could go. A burnt warehouse, a riot or coordinated resistance on a large plantation required more force than an unpaid watchman or a part-time constable could provide. In such moments, colonial communities turned to broader tools: posses, sheriff's warrants, or, in the South, organized patrols backed by plantation law. The gap between local duties and large-scale enforcement is where later institutions found their mandate to become professional, centralized, and eventually uniformed. Understanding constables and watches matters because they left procedural and cultural marks. They normalized the idea of public officers who could enter private space, stop people in public, and impose penalties, practices that later police organizations adopted and formalized. Their records, meeting minutes, ordinances, and ledgers give us a detailed view of how ordinary governance unfolded in daily life. Those same records also show the limits of local justice and the conditions that pushed colonies toward organized, paid enforcement in the 19th century. If this section raises questions about how familiar institutions began, tap like to tell me to keep unpacking the procedures and statutes that shaped everyday enforcement, the sheriff's expanding reach, and how county-level authority altered the scale of law. When settlements spread beyond a single town square, the limits of local enforcement became clear. That gap is where the sheriff's office grew into a vital instrument of colonial governance. The sheriff arrived in America as an extension of the English shire reeve, an officer responsible for keeping the king's peace across a county. In the colonial context, sheriffs enforced court judgments, managed jails, collected taxes, and, when needed, raised posses to pursue fugitives. Their authority reached beyond a single street or neighborhood. It tied scattered settlements into a wider legal framework. A sheriff's duties blended administration and force. He served writs and summonses issued by county courts, executed judgments that could include seizure of property, and maintained the county jail, where a constable might resolve a tavern quarrel. A sheriff could enforce a signed court order that changed property relations or removed a person from their home. That capacity mattered in frontier areas and expanding towns, where disputes over land, debt, and labor required a scalable tool to carry out legal decisions. The sheriff was the state's physical will, not merely its clerk. Sheriffs also organized a temporary mobilization of force. When a community needed to pursue a suspect beyond town limits, sheriffs issued warrants and called out posses. Those posses were local men, often neighbors or tenants, summoned to chase a runaway or to suppress disorder. In the southern colonies, this mechanism intersected with patrol systems that protected plantation labor. In the north, it supported the enforcement of debts and property claims. The power to assemble men and to execute court orders made sheriffs central actors in turning administrative decisions into lived consequences. The office shaped everyday realities in other ways. Sheriffs collected taxes and levies that funded local projects and courts. Their accounting determined who could remain solvent and who might lose land. They ran jails where detainees waited for trials or for sale in the case of enslaved people declared runaways. Those jails were not neutral institutions. They enacted the legal system's most immediate coercive outcomes. When sheriffs carried out auctions of seized goods or transported prisoners, their work made the abstract language of law tangible and irreversible for ordinary people. With power concentrated at the county level came risks of abuse and entanglement with local elites. Sheriffs were often local men who depended on planter or merchant favor. In some places, their office became an instrument through which wealthy interests shaped enforcement priorities. That dependence could influence decisions about who'd pursue and who'd protect, about how rigorously to enforce poor debts, or when to deploy force against labor unrest. Records show sheriffs enforcing both small claims and larger, politically sensitive orders. The pattern reveals how legal power and local influence frequently overlapped. Over time, the sheriff's expanding reach helped normalize a scale of enforcement that could be delegated and institutionalized. The practical effect was to widen the radius of formal legal power. No longer confined to a village green, enforcement could follow people across roads and rivers, into courts and jails. That expansion made possible later institutional forms, centralized departments, permanent jails, standardized warrants, because it established common procedures for arrest, detention, and execution of judgments across broader territories. Understanding the sheriff's role clarifies an important transition. Enforcement moved from improvised neighbor action into a structured apparatus capable of implementing systemic decisions. That apparatus could maintain order, but it could also enforce social hierarchies by rhythmically executing laws shaped by economic and political elites. If you want the specific statutes and court orders that illustrate this shift, comment sources. In the southern colonies, the practical need to manage labor turned swiftly into a legal apparatus. As plantations expanded in the late 17th and early 18th centuries, colonial legislatures wrote codes and ordinances that treated the movement of enslaved people as a matter of public order. Those laws did not speak in abstractions. They specified curfews, passes, and the duty of white men to stop and question anyone who could not account for their presence. In South Carolina and Virginia, statutes from the early 1700s institutionalized patrols whose job was explicit: find runaways, enforce curfews, break up gatherings, and deter rebellion. What began as ad hoc coercion hardened into routine, lawful practice. The patrol was a different instrument from a town watch. A watchman walked a lane to guard against fire or theft. A patrol rode to preserve a labor system. Patrols were typically organized as groups of able-bodied white men who were obliged by custom, statute, or local fiat to ride or walk certain roads at certain times. They stopped people, demanded proof of authorization to travel, and used force when compliance failed. The sound of hooves and the command to dismount carried the authority of law and the threat of violence. The public space became a regulated zone where identity and movement were policed along racial lines. These systems served layered interests. For planters, patrols protected the plantation's most valuable asset: human labor. For some poor white men, acting as patrollers offered a rare chance to wield legal authority and gain status within a rigid social order. For colonial governments, patrols promised a cheap, decentralized means of maintaining stability without building costly standing forces. But the moral calculation that justified these arrangements was simple and damning. Certain bodies would be presumed suspect, and the law would back those presumptions. The human cost was immediate. Families could be separated by a sudden stop on a road. A mispass or an inability to prove permission could result in whipping, incarceration, sale, or worse. Public punishments and quick trials were tools of deterrence. Public humiliation was part of the maintenance of control. And because patrols operated in ordinary spaces, roads, markets, bridges, the experience of being policed became a daily fact of life for many black people in the colonies. It's important to trace the administrative mechanics. Ordinances named the men required to serve. Local magistrates issued instructions. Justices recorded fines and penalties. Those procedural details mattered because they normalized intervention. Legal forms, warrants, pass systems, fines. Train local actors to see stopping and searching as routine work. The practical techniques developed in these patrols, stopping people in public, demanding documents, organizing searches, calling out posses, are methods, not metaphors. They were practical tools later institutions could adopt and adapt. Scholars debate how directly these patrol systems fed into the modern police institution. Some argue the connection is structural. Patterns of surveillance, the policing of movement, and racially focused suspicion carried forward into later formations of law enforcement. Others stress multiple roots. English parish policing, urban watch traditions, and the needs of commerce also shaped what policing became. The careful view holds both ideas. Patrols formed a powerful regional template for racialized control, and when the nation urbanized and professionalized, many of those practices found new homes inside formal departments. This is a moral turning point because it shows how legal authority can be used to cement inequality. Where a watchman's duty grew from neighborly protection, the patrol system formalized suspicion as law. That shift teaches a crucial lesson. Once practices of stopping, searching, and detaining become ordinary and recorded in legal paper, they are harder to undo. The rules that institutionalize suspicion tend to persist in habit and procedure long after the immediate conditions that produce them have changed. When we look back at these patrols, we see instruments of control that were efficient and normalized, and we also see the lives they damaged. Understanding that dual reality is not an academic exercise. It is a necessary step toward asking why certain policing practices endure whom they serve and how communities might restructure safety so it protects rather than presumes guilt. Scholars and public commentators continue to argue about how directly colonial practices, especially slave patrols, fed into the institutions we now call police. The debate is not academic hair-splitting. It shapes how communities interpret present-day patterns of enforcement, who is expected to answer for harms, and what reforms might actually change. Two broad lines of interpretation dominate the conversation. 8-1 argument traces a strong, structural line from patrols to modern policing. Historians and commentators in this camp point to Southern statutes and routine practices that normalize stopping, searching, and detaining particular bodies. They emphasize that patrol systems were legal, organized, and persistent, not merely episodic, and that the techniques developed their document checks. Roving patrols organized posses, created procedural habits that later institutions could adopt. Scholars such as Sally E. Haddon and public historians have shown how patrol ordinances, records of stops, and routines of enforcement became embedded in local governance and social life across generations. From this perspective, some features of 20th and 21st century policing, the surveillance of public space, the presumptive suspicion of particular communities, the routine use of force, have deep precedents. The other argument stresses plurality and contingency. Proponents of this view point to English parish practices, urban watches, and the logistical needs of commerce as equally important roots. They note that early American enforcement drew heavily from English models, constables, night watches, sheriffs, which were reorganized to meet local conditions. In this account, slave patrols are one important regional element among many. They shaped policing where slavery structured social life, but they did not single-handedly produce modern departments that emerged later, often in northern cities, under different social pressures. Critics of a single-origin thesis argue that conflating patrols with later police risks oversimplifying origins and understating how practices evolved in response to urbanization, industrial labor, and legal reform. A careful reading holds these claims together rather than forcing a binary choice. Patrols clearly provide a legal template for racially focused control in the South. English-derived offices supplied organizational forms and vocabulary, and urban demands for proper protection and public order pushed cities toward professionalized, paid forces. When a nation urbanized and centralized certain powers, institutions absorbed techniques and mindsets from multiple sources. That blended inheritance helps explain why debates about bias, force, and oversight are both structural and historically rooted. The modern legacy is concrete in three ways. First, procedural techniques, stopping people in public, demanding documentation, and organizing responses to perceived disorder, traveled across time and place as routinized practices. Second, patterns of who was policed and why often followed social hierarchies rooted in property, race, and class. Third, legal forms, warrants, ordinances, codes, normalized intervention in ordinary spaces and made enforcement a routine administrative activity rather than an exceptional one. Those continuities do not prove determinism. They show how habits become institutional memory and why certain practices persist even after their original contexts have changed. What follows from this mixed legacy is both practical and moral. Practically, reformers and policymakers must reckon with embedded procedures and local histories if they hope to change outcomes. Legal forms and administrative habits are resilient. Morally, tracing origins forces communities to confront uncomfortable truths about how systems of protection and control were shaped and whose safety was prioritized. As we move to the final section, keep this question in mind. When an institution carries multiple origins, some protective, some coercive, how do we choose which practices to keep, which to reform, and which to discard? Your answer will guide how history informs action, and that conversation is the necessary next step. The story of policing in colonial America is more than offices and ordinances. It is a record of choices, practical, legal, moral, that shaped who was counted as a neighbor and who was treated as a subject. Constables and night watches grew from the conviction that safety could be shared, that ordinary people could hold public life together. Sheriffs extended that reach into broader territories, turning local disputes into enforceable judgments. And where plantation economies demanded control, patrol systems transformed suspicion into law. Those three strands did not run parallel. They braided together, producing an inheritance with both protective practices and coercive tools. That mixed legacy matters because institutions keep memory. Procedures become habit. Paperwork, passes, warrants, ordinances, trains officials and citizens to act in certain ways. Routine stops, document checks, and organized patrols shift from exceptional measures into expected practice. When these techniques are embedded in law and custom, they outlast the particular circumstances that produce them. Habits of enforcement become part of administrative memory, and administrative memory shapes how new policies are applied. There is also a human cost recorded in those minutes and ledgers. For some, a lantern and a rattleman sleep restored. For others, the same light signaled fear and loss. For planners, patrols protected labor. For the patrolled, they exposed bodies to constant inspection and risk. For constables and sheriffs, daily duties could mean hard decisions. Enforce a fine, make an arrest, carry out a judgment that changed someone's life. Those small, administrative acts accumulated into lasting consequences. If history teaches anything useful, it is that change begins with clarity. Naming the origins of a practice, whether protective or punitive, makes reform possible. When we see which legal choices produce harm, we can unpick them, amend statutes, redesign procedures, retrain officers, and build accountability into the administration of public safety. Change will not be fast. It will not be simple, but it is achievable if communities insist on different rules and different priorities. So what should we do with this knowledge? First, read the records where they exist. Listen to the marginalized voices that rare documents hide, but that oral histories can reveal. Second, evaluate current practice against ethical standards anchored in equal protection and dignity. Third, act. Support policies that reduce biased discretion, expand community oversight, and invest in forms of safety that do not rely primarily on coercion. If this episode made you think, leave a comment. Which historic practice do you see echoed in your town? Subscribe if you want more investigations like this, and share the video with someone who cares about how the past shapes public life. We inherit institutions. We also decide how they will be used. Which direction will your community choose?